Epic Church, what's up? So good to be back. It is so good to be back. Some of you haven't been here in 2 weeks either. You didn't know we were gone, but so good to get away and to be able to be refreshed. Shauna and I got to do that for a few days, and then we joined our team in Uganda, and so really an incredible time. You'll hear more about that in just even a moment. But I want to say a special thanks to Brad, our worship pastor, and Will Maraza on our staff. They really held things down while the rest of us were gone. We have 6 people on staff here at Epic, and 4 of us decided to go to Africa for a couple of weeks. So Brad and Will, leading the charge from a staff perspective. We have very capable volunteers throughout our church, but from the staff perspective, they were really leading that. And what's interesting, it's always an adventure around here. So during the 2 weeks we were gone, those are the only 2 guys really have any authority on the staff. We're glad they didn't run off with a bank account and sell the building while we were gone, and all those kind of things. But during that time, Brad gets pneumonia, and he's still struggling. That's why he wasn't singing as much as maybe you wanted him to this morning. Thanks to Ben Lee for filling in. Brad gets pneumonia, and Will's wife, Bee, decides to give birth to their second child. I'm like, guys, I left you in charge. I mean, come on. You're all I've got. So most pastors might say they will never go out of town and take vacation again. I'm not most pastors. So glad that you're here. I'm glad to be back. There's a place that I love being on Sundays. It's a people more than a place that I love being with. I love what God's up to in our church. Heard great reports while we were out. And so glad to be back. Speaking of Uganda, come to the lunch next week. You've got a free lunch opportunity, which I know some of you're already there. You don't even care what we're talking about. Those of you who are students, and you will be there. But the rest of you, it's going to be a free lunch, but it's going to be a great time. And let me just say this. I have never, and I know we throw around words like this at times, but I've never seen the kind of tangible difference that we, through a partnership, are able to make, like what I've seen in Uganda. To literally know our church, and I'll just give you a snippet of what we experienced and why I'm so grateful and why you, I think, should be thrilled for our partnership there. We sponsor about 50 kids there, and somebody like, oh, what does all that go to? And what's really cool for us is that we're able to look and see where our money goes. That when our sponsored child, mine and Shauna, and our boys, we sponsor a kid named Saddam, and we've gotten close to him. We got to spend time with him this last week, and you're able to see on his chart, when he got malaria in December, he was able to have hospitalization because of the funds that we give to that. We were able to see how our funds are helping him go to school. It's a private school. Our funds are helping him go to school. What does he rank, 9th in the class right now? We're going to get him first, but he's 8th out of 65 right now, and so we're going to work, and we're going to get him there. So you're able to see that, and then able to see the money-provided curriculum and teachers. Every Saturday, the kids come for multiple hours. They're fed, maybe one of their main meals of the week. They're fed there at the Compassion Center, but then they're taught what it looks like for Jesus to have a plan for their life and what it means to follow him, things that we talk about here and sometimes take for granted. So you see that. And then two Decembers ago, we do this thing every December and January called the Hope Project here at Epic. And basically what it is, it's our big offering for the year that funds all of our partnerships in San Francisco, around the U.S., and around the world. And from the very beginning, really from our infancy, before the church was even a year old, we wanted to say we care about what's going on outside of the walls of Epic. Locally, nationally, internationally. And so we began this partnership with United Christian Center Church in Kampala, Uganda. And we've gotten to know the staff since then there, and it's an amazing church, a really large church, but we've been able to encourage them. And one of the things we did 2 offerings ago is we gave money to fund basically a cosmetology school for women in that community. No, I didn't learn anything while I was there about cosmetology. However, what's awesome is that we were funding something that allowed them to essentially learn cosmetology in a 6-month program and also to learn what it takes to open up a salon. Now, the funniest part of the whole thing is that what we call salon, they call saloon. okay? And so, like, your mom may get upset with you and you tell her that our church is funding saloons all over Africa, but it's true. That's what they call them there. And we, such a privilege. You always wonder, like, certainly we thought great integrity behind the organization we're giving to. You guys I think we gave $10,000 for this project, but being over there, we actually were there when they had the graduation for the very first class that went through the cosmetology and the opening up salon school. It was incredible. 25 women who not only have the kind of dignity they were looking for, but they actually have a way to provide now for their families. And part of what's going to happen is they start their businesses, they're going to give back to the next round, and it's just going to be this beautiful cyclical thing where you can actually see, like, we're not just helping kids, which is huge, we're actually helping families not just earn a trade, but to make a living and be able to continue to just reproduce that over and over and over again. What we did with our last offering is we actually have bought a mill that's going to produce jobs and produce, obviously, food for the people in this community. And so let me just say, this is not a pastor speaking here. This is just someone who's seen something that I think is now the easiest sell I'll ever have to make. To be up close and personal and have people tell us. I remember walking for the graduation for the saloon, Shauna and I got to be chancellor and vice chancellor, which was awesome. The first time I got to do anything great. Of course, they had a gown for me, but even though I've lost some weight, I haven't lost enough weight. And so the gown didn't fit me. Luckily, the pastor's bigger than I am, so we both just laughed about not having gowns that fit. But we got to be part of the cake cutting ceremony, and but to start the morning for the graduation, they did a parade, like a 3-mile parade around the community. And I've never really gotten to be a part of a parade, just one of those things I've missed out on in life. And so they hire a marching band, and we just start walking on the dirt roads of Kampala, throwing out flyers about the school, and just celebrating those women. But now those women, they have dignity, and they have a way to make income for themselves. And I just want to say, like, it is such a beautiful thing. I remember walking with a girl during that parade, and she, super vulnerable. She had just had triplets 9 months ago. And she literally said that because of what our church in San Francisco is doing there, her kids are able to survive, and she's actually able to take care of them now because she's part of a program over there. And when those people are sitting across from you, there's no BS going on in that. It is like, I mean, she's just going, hey, I want you to know these kids have life because of what your church is doing. Like, okay, I can get behind that. I can give my life towards things that will promote that more and more. I can pray that our church will grow so we can do more in Kampala. You know what I'm saying? And that I would become more generous and that we as a community would become more generous. So anyway, I know Tim already talked about the lunch next week. If you're looking for a free lunch or amazing stories, come. We've got video interviews, let you know what we're doing, what the future looks like, how you can be a part. But really excited to be a part of a church that's investing in things that are affecting the globe. And we want to do that increasingly, more and more and more. And it'll be fun to see. When we started this church a little more than 2 years ago, the reason we did so, not because we were bored, although if you are bored, this will take care of it. We did so because we felt like God was calling us to create a specific kind of community in this strategic city of San Francisco. That's what that was the heartbeat of it. And we began to imagine and to envision a certain kind of community. We envisioned and imagined a community that would, a community that would be really diverse, but really unified around Jesus and his mission for us. We began to envision a community that would care more about the whole than just themselves. We began to envision a community that would be deeply attached to one another, but not so close to one another that there was no room for new people to enter into that community. And as we continue on in our No More Religion series this morning, it's really interesting. Most of this series has been about us saying, hey, Paul's writing this letter to churches in Galatia, and he's saying you don't need more religion. They were told if they'll just do more for God, maybe they'll get a better standing with God. And so we've really been focused on how it affects our individual relationship with God. But for today's text, Paul is going to talk about how it affects how you and I relate to each other. What does this whole idea of no more religion mean for how you and I live together? What does it mean for us as a church? What does it mean for those of us in community with one another? What does it look like, and how does it affect us? And here's the big idea for this morning, and then I'll give you the text. The big deal for this morning is this. Religion, though it seems very God-centered, right? It's like, of course, that's a God-centered word. Everyone in the world would say that's a God-centered word. It actually, in the way we're defining it, it's very me-centered. right? Because we've defined religions as saying, hey, whatever we can do for God will determine whether we can get to God, whether we can get his approval and his acceptance. But if we do that, it seems very God-centered, but it actually makes the focus on me, right? Because the question is no longer, what has God done for me? The question becomes, what can I do to get God? And so it all becomes really self-focused, though it has this kind of facade of being very much a spiritual thing. And what I want to say to us as a community this morning is that if we can put into practice what we're going to see and hear in just a moment, I believe the potential for what God can do in us and through us as a church community really is unlimited. So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn to the back of Galatians chapter 5, the end of that chapter. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We've got great volunteers that are already on spot and ready to hand you a Bible. This is yours to keep. Feel free to grab one. Galatians, I think that's page 632. I believe that's right. If it's wrong, yell it out loud, whatever it is. Everybody having a good summer so far? Everybody enjoying the heat? No. I moved here not because of this. You know what I'm saying? I'm a pansy. I'll just be honest. I'm a 50s and 60s kind of guy. Just what I enjoy. So, when our next to last week in this series, we've been looking at this letter that Paul wrote to these churches in Galatia. And just to catch you up or to let you know first time, the reason Paul wrote this letter to these churches in Galatia, Paul helped start these churches. He shared with them the gospel message that we get to God by grace alone, through faith alone, and Jesus alone. But Paul has since gone on to plant other churches. And now these teachers have come in, just like we're doing this morning. Teachers have come in, false teachers, and said, hey, Paul didn't give you the whole truth. It is Jesus, but it's all this other stuff. You need to be circumcised. You need to observe certain days and months. You need to have strict dietary laws. You need to make sure that you abstain from certain things. And what Paul is writing this letter to tell them is, hey, that's not what it's about. You don't need more religion. You need to rest in what Jesus has done for you, okay? The question today is, what in the world? I get what it means for my vertical relationship with God, but what in the world does this big idea of no more religion, what does it mean for my relationship with you? If you'll stand, I'd love to read to you some thoughts from Paul, and then we'll talk about what it means. It seems disconnected on the surface because he's going to get into this whole way we relate to one another based off this idea of not needing more religion, but resting in the grace of this gospel message from Jesus. So we'll start with the last verse in chapter 5, verse 26. We'll read through verse 5 of chapter 6. Here's what Paul says. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. You may be seated. And you're not alone if you're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with everything else we've been saying in the series? Because the series has been predominantly focused on our vertical relationship with God, right? Because every human being, if they were to ever think there's a God that exists, the question that every kind of religion asks is this question, what does it take to get to God, right? And inherently, probably every one of us have thought about this, and what we've been saying in the series is, hey, it's not more religion. What Paul's saying to the Galatians is you don't need more. Like those of you, remember some things that were going on. The false teachers were saying, hey, if you really want to be on God's side, you need to be circumcised, right? And so, hey, I know you're 35 years old, but step right up, and we're going to get you acceptable to God. And here's the thing. Some of us are like, why would you ever do that? But the reality is, if I were to tell you today there are 10 things you need to do by this time next week to be on God's side, every one of us would stay up late and we would go for it. We would spend the money we have to get there. We would take courses on whatever we need to take courses on. We would do whatever we need to do concerning each other and how we live because we want, I think, to have access and be accepted by God. We want His approval. And so the Galatians, even though Paul had taught them, and here's the big idea of this series. I think it'll be on the screen, but what we've been saying and how we've defined this in this series is that religion, the idea of doing certain things to earn God's approval and His acceptance, religion doesn't make us right with God. We are made right with God by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. Paul had shared this message with the Galatians, but they began to wander away from this message. They began to hear these teachers say, you need to do all these things. And so that makes sense for us when we think about our vertical relationship with God. I don't need to do all these things. I need to rest in what Jesus has done for me. This is the big idea of grace, perhaps our favorite concept in the entire scope of Christianity. In fact, if it's not, we need to maybe be introduced to what the concept is. So the question is, why does Paul begin to talk to the Galatians no longer about how they relate to God? He begins to talk to the Galatians about how they relate to each other. Is there a disconnect, or does this no more religion theme have anything to do with how you and I interact within this community called Epic and with any other community that you're a part of in your life? What does it have to do with it? If you look at verse 26, Paul gets after this idea of, hey, don't be conceited, don't provoke one another, and don't be envious or jealous of one another. And the question is, why does Paul state these things? Why does he say, don't be conceited, don't provoke one another, don't be jealous of one another? What do those things have to do with anything at all? Well, let's think about it this way for a moment. If religion and our performance is our way to God, then I need to do more than you do, right? If I don't know where I stand and if I've done enough, then even if I can't answer what enough is, I know that I need to be further ahead than you are, right? And if you begin to take this idea that the Galatians were doing, remember, if someone stands up and tells you, hey, you need to be circumcised, you need to not eat, here's your list of things you don't need to eat, here's a list of things you need to do, here's the Jewish law, you need to adhere to this, here's certain days you need to observe. If you were handed that one Sunday, you would want to come back the next Sunday and have done all of the things that they told you to do, right? And guess what happens when you begin to realize that grace isn't what you're after, but religion is what you're after? Comparison begins to set in. Does that make sense? Because if it's not grace, then you and I have to rely on ourselves. And if I have to rely on myself, and if getting to God is Jesus plus something else, then I want to have more of something else than you have. Because I want to be closest to God. And if grace doesn't exist, I cast grace aside, then it's up to me and I rely on myself and my good works and how can I impress God and how can I get to God, then guess what? I become self-absorbed. You've been there before? And so the question is in verse 26, how can he talk about being conceited and talk about being jealous? Those two seem like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. Let me tell you how they relate. If you bank on religion and works to get yourself to God, and it becomes about you, then whenever you're around other people, comparison's always going to set in. And the reason Paul talks about being conceited and being jealous is this reason right here. And we've all done this, when you find yourself in a room of people who have not as much as you have, who aren't as gifted as you are, who aren't as advanced or who aren't as religious as you are, guess what you begin to feel? Conceited, right? Well, why does he talk about being envious? Because the moment you find yourself in a room with people who have more than you, right? Who are smarter than you, who are more religious than you, who have more experience or more money or whatever the case may be, all of a sudden you're no longer conceited, you're what? You're jealous, you're envious, you're despairing because you're so absorbed in yourself. And the Galatians were thinking that it's up to us for our standing with God, and if it's up to us, then the question I need to ask is, what do I need to do to get more of God? Rather than asking, okay, has God's grace affected me in any way? And if it has, I don't have to worry about how I compare to you. If you want to know whether or not you're living by this religious idea that the Galatians were, or you're living by the grace that Jesus came to give, the question is to ask is this: when you're with people who don't have what you have, are you conceited? I know most of you don't say anything out loud. Some of you do. But are you conceited? And by the same token, are you, when you're with people who have a lot more than what you have, does it show up in envy and despair for you and jealousy? If you look at the phrase in the middle, provoking one another, the idea there is literally to challenge someone to a contest. Now, is there anyone in here who's hyper-competitive besides the pastor? Really? Really? All right. Chronic liars and some hyper-competitive people. I want to win at everything. Like, I love making up games just so I can win. I just do. I just want to win. And I don't think competition is totally bad, but what happens in this realm with the Galatians, you can imagine what this would be like. If I can perform a certain way and get myself a great standing with God, then what I want to know is, how do you stack up with me? Right? How do you and I measure up? And what I begin to do is compare myself, and I become so self-absorbed. And when you and I become self-absorbed, we can't live out the rest of the text that Paul gives us here. You know why? Because everything you do will be about you. Even when you spend large amounts of money to give Christmas gifts to someone else, guess who it's still about? It's you. You want them to acknowledge you. You want to have value. You want to look. You won't really be generous, but you want to look more generous than the other people in the church. Why? Because you've been told by these teachers, whatever you do will determine your standing with God. You want to do everything. And so even when it looks like you're being selfless, you're really being full of yourself. Now, religion seems so God-centric, but it's really man-centered. It's really about me, what I can accomplish, what I can attain, how I can put God in my debt, how I can make God respond in a certain way, how I can earn his approval. And what Paul's doing throughout this letter, the whole letter to the Galatians, he's trying to say, why are you trying to earn what's already been given to you? Well, how does that play out in how we relate to each other? If I'm so consumed with trying to earn God's grace, to earn God's favor or his acceptance, guess who I don't have any time or energy or focus for? Anyone else. If you want to know why this isn't being played out, when you get to verse 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, you want to know why these things aren't being played out in your life or in the community that you're a part of, the reason is because you're so self-absorbed. You got blinders on and you can't help it because you're living under this reality that it's up to you. And if it's up to you, guess who you can't think about? And so Paul goes on in verse 1, he says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a gentle way, should restore him with gentleness. What Paul's trying to help them understand is this: if the religious performance is the thing that you're after, if it's the thing that you're counting on, then guess what your reaction will be when someone in the community is struggling with some sin? You'll actually be excited. Why? Because then you can say, at least I'm not as bad as that guy or girl. But Paul says if you understand it's grace, first of all, you'll have this change of heart that Jesus brings, and you'll recognize the only reason you're not struggling with that same thing, perhaps right now, is because of grace. But he goes on to say, watch out, lest you be tempted in the same way. When you see someone struggling, if you're self-absorbed, you will almost be glad that they're struggling, and you will look down on them because they're struggling. But if you're absorbed with grace and you have this proper outlook for what God has given you and what he's made you, then you will know, hey, you know what? God's grace is sufficient for them. They can count on the same grace that I have to count on. Doesn't matter if they're better, worse, how long their list is, right? And so he says, restore them gently. Now, I love that he says restore them gently because here's what we typically do. The Galatians apparently did, and we probably do it too, way too much. We go one of two ways. When someone we know within the community that we're part of is struggling with some kind of sin, one response we typically give is just to dismiss it and pretend like it's no big deal, right? Like, it's okay. I don't care if you murdered somebody. You're just going with your life, right? The other response we typically give, if we're going to call them out on what they're doing wrong, we call them out in a harsh way, right? So we either dismiss what they're doing or we go over the top with how harsh we are and we're not helpful to them at all. But what Paul is saying is, hey, restore them. You can't dismiss it. Restore them, but do it in a gentle way. The word here for restore is literally the word to reset a bone in the body that's out of alignment. Painful, right? But necessary. Painful, but necessary. And some of you have had doctors who didn't do it so gentle, right? Right? He's saying you've got to reset them. They need to be realigned with Christ. They need to get back into who God has made them to be, what God has intended for them to do, how God has designed them. They need to get realigned, but you need to do it in a gentle way. And some of us, maybe every one of us in this room, we fall typically on one of two sides. Some of you need to, in a loving way, call out people in your life who are struggling in sin. And others that don't have a problem calling people out, you need to start adding some doses of gentleness to that. Okay? Likely every one of us, including me in this room, we tend to go one of two ways in that situation. We either don't say anything about it, or we don't handle it in the right way with gentleness. Say something with love, but be gentle in the way that you say it. And he goes on in verse 2, and he begins to talk about bearing one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. You need to understand this. You cannot do verse 2 if you're self-absorbed, right? If you're self-absorbed, you will always, anytime you're around other people, you will always think one of two things. I'm superior to this person or I'm inferior to this person. But the thing that you'll be consumed with is you. And what Paul's trying to say is, hey, because grace is available to you, because in Jesus Christ, God has approved of you, guess what you don't have to do? You don't have to prove yourselves to each other. You don't have to see how you measure up against the rest of the crowd. You don't have to wonder, where do you fit in with how much has been accomplished or achieved with the people you're around. You don't have to worry about that. Why? Because everyone in the circle, their only hope is grace. So you don't have to wonder about where you stand. And when you realize that, what Paul's trying to help you understand is then you're free to actually care for one another. We have a mantra around here that we say that life is meant to be shared. Right? We believe wholeheartedly in this idea that God didn't create us to live isolated lives. God did not create us to live lives that were individualistic and focused on ourselves, that he's called us into community, and that religion is a very individualistic thing, but when we understand this gospel message, it always has a communal effect. Always. And so we're called to bear one another's burdens. I really believe there are lots of ways to gauge the health of a church, right? We have metrics that we keep up with. We think about what's going on. We see what God's doing in people's lives. But I think one of the best ways for us to gauge the spiritual health of Epic Church is to see how much verse 2 is being lived out here. To see, are we really the community that we're supposed to be? Are we really bearing one another's burdens? And as long as we're consumed with ourselves, we can't carry each other's burdens. Let me give you some ways this is happening in our church and just give you some examples and then just say that we need to see more and more and more of this. Once we're freed by grace, we can go carry one another's burdens. We were coming back from Uganda, and obviously Will's wife, B, gave birth on the 22nd. Yeah, the day before, and we didn't have it. He still had to teach. I don't know that I would have been able to do that, but he did. And they were talking about getting meals for the Mirazes whenever we got back. Someone had asked a question about that. And another person said, well, you're going to have to wait 2 weeks because our church is already providing all of their first 2 weeks of meals. That's what it looks like to bear someone's burden. We had some people on our Uganda team that had this great calling to go, but just the math didn't add up. They didn't have the funds that they needed. And they didn't stand on the stage and say, with a bucket and say, hey, I'm going to Uganda. Somebody do this, but at the same time, because God had given them the desire, we had other people that God had given a desire to help out who couldn't go. We had an individual say, hey, here's $2,000. I don't know if anybody else needs the help. Well, they did need the help. That's what it looks like to bear someone else's burden. When you lend your vocational network to people in this community to try to help them gain employment, that's what it looks like to bear someone else's burden. When you help people move in, when you spend time with people and you're just present with people in the midst of their pain, that's what it looks like to bear someone's burden. About 2 months ago, we had a young lady in our church, and she was, I forget everything that happened, but she ended up, for the moment at least, being paralyzed from the waist down. And she was a college student. She'd only been going to our church for about a month. She had just recently auditioned to be a singer and was getting ready to get into the rotation of our worship team. And again, she'd only been here for about a month. Well, it ended up being an incredibly serious medical issue for a couple months. And she's from Alaska. And so her mom and dad flew down here. They didn't know anyone. I got a note one day, said, hey, can someone from the church call this family and just see how we can help? And so we called them. We ended up being able to provide lots of things for them, care for them, beds for the apartment they rented while they were here. And you know what I thought about? If she had not attached herself to a community, it happened to be this one, but if she had not attached herself to this community, guess who wouldn't have been able to bear any of her burdens? If you don't attach yourself to a community like this or to this community, you won't be able to enjoy either side of verse 2. You will not be able to bear anyone else's burdens because you won't know anyone. You won't really know them. I mean, you don't really get to know them by just being here on Sundays, right? And if you don't really know someone, then when they have an issue come up, you won't even know about it. It's not that you can't help them. It's that you can't help them because you just don't know. And you won't be able to enjoy the other side of it. People aren't going to be able to bear your burdens. Why? Because if you don't attach yourself deeply enough, no one knows you have an issue. No one knows that you need help. No one knows that you need a job in this field. Even though we have that field represented in this community, nobody knows that you need help getting the job with the technology company because we don't know you. You can't bear the burdens of people that you at least don't know or have access to in some way. And what I would love to see is for this to be the thing that marks us as a church. Even for people out there who don't yet believe all that we believe, if they could say, I don't know about all that. I'm still figuring out the Jesus thing. I'm not sure. I'm new to religion, and that happens a lot. But I do know this. That's a people. That's a group. That's a community that takes care of one another. If that could mark us, that would be living in the way of Jesus. I think that those are the kind of things that make God smile. One of Jesus' last prayers while he was on earth is that we would be one. That we would be one. And as long as you and I stay self-absorbed, we will not carry one another's burdens. You'll carry your burden. It'll be too heavy for you because you think you have to carry it alone. You'll forget that Jesus carried it to the cross. You don't have to carry it. You don't have to bear it. And you'll be free to bear the burden of someone else. This is what it really looks like to follow Jesus, just so we know. He goes on in verse 3, and he begins to talk about this idea that be careful that you don't think you're something when you're actually nothing. Now, if you just read that at face value, you might think that God's wanting us to have low self-esteem, right? Now, you're nothing. The idea is what we just sang about a second ago. The idea is that we recognize that without you, I am nothing. Okay, it's not I am nothing, period. If you think about the whole gospel in context. It's not I am nothing, period. It's that without God, I am nothing. And so I recognize that everything I am and all that I've been given is traced back to the hand of God. That's called grace. If you want to know whether you're being a person that's being persuaded by this idea of being more religious, or if you're living in grace, ask yourself this question. There's a great way, and it'll get it right for you every time. Am I leaning towards pride or humility? We've said all throughout the series, religion brings pride. Why? Because religion, as we've defined it in the series, it's not what God's done for me, it's what I've done for God. I'm responsible, I rely on myself, but grace always brings humility because grace says, I realize what I deserve, and God has given me so much more than I deserve. And I trace everything, my job, this community, my part in this community, my gifts, my intelligence, my education, my relationships, my children, I trace it all back to the hand of God. And if you don't trace it back to the hand of God, then it's going to result in pride, and you're going to be depending on yourself. The problem with that is that you can't do enough to get yourself to God. That's the problem. And so we need to ask ourselves, am I leaning towards pride, or am I leaning towards humility? Now, don't start boasting in your humility, because then you start going the other way, okay? Don't talk about how awesome you are because you're so humble, okay? That might defeat the purpose. And then Paul ends this section in verse 4 and 5 with what seems to me, at first glance, to be a contradiction, right? You guys remember verse 2, right? Bear one another's burdens. But what does he say in 4 and 5? He says, but let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. Wait, didn't he just say, what did he just tell us to do in verse 2? He said, bear one another's burdens in verse 2, and in verse 5, he's saying, I've got to bear my own load. What does this mean? Well, there's two different words used here for burden and load. So when you think about verse 2, it is that as you struggle with sin or you struggle with needs that you have in your life, I want to come alongside you and bear that with you. But when he gets to verse 5 and he's talking about you and I having to bear our own load, here's what he's saying. No one else can carry out the assignment for you that God has given you. In the end of time, when my days are over, God will not ask me how I lived out his purpose for you. Do you know that? God will ask me, Ben, were you faithful with what I gave you? God will not ask me, Ben, why didn't you grow the largest church? He won't ask me that. He won't ask me, why didn't I do more of what you did? He will simply ask me the question, Ben, with all that I handed you, your wiring, your gifts, your connections, your calling, the period of time in which you lived, the city that you lived in, with all that I gave you, what'd you do with it? What did you do with it? And this is such a freeing thing. He's getting after the comparison thing again. You can imagine, maybe you remember this, after Jesus had risen from the dead and he's interacting with Peter and all that, and he's talking to Peter about how his future is going to go, and it's not a bright future for how Peter's going to die, he's going to suffer. Peter asks a very logical question. He says to Jesus, but what about the other boys, right? What about my friends here? What's going to happen to them? And Jesus says something to the effect of, don't worry what I have for them. Be concerned with what I have for you. So he's not saying in verse 5, go all selfish. He's saying this, Are you going to be faithful with the load I've given you? Are you going to be faithful with the assignment I've given you? Jesus said in John 4:34, he said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Paul said in Acts 20:24, he said, may my life be of no value to me except that I can essentially say that I was able to finish the course God gave me. This is very freeing, isn't it? It doesn't matter if you've done more than I have if God doesn't have that for me. And so what you need to think about is what has God given you in regards to your gifting, your experience, your intelligence. And just know that, listen, we want to compare ourselves to people, but we need to be free to know that God's not comparing us to anybody. You know what he's measuring us against? The assignment and call he's given us. So some of you who've been given more because of God's grace or because of certain things, you who've been given more, you're going to be held more accountable than the rest of us. Right? In a room this size, some of you grew up with great parents and others of you didn't. The ones who probably grew up in a great home are probably going to have more to give account for than those of us who didn't. And I'm not in the didn't. I'm in the good category on this one. Some of you who were able to get into certain universities and had privilege to certain kinds of education, not because, if it's a laziness issue, that's something else. But thankfully, God's going to hold you more accountable than he's going to hold me since I went to a state school. I did my best, okay? This is very freeing, It's like when Tim and I are over at the gym and he's lifting so much more weight than I am. It's like, man, God, I'm so glad. It's just so freeing that I don't have to do that. But this is it really is a freeing thing. Think about even how maybe your parents parented you or how we parent our kids, right? A lot of times, and we do this, I'm at fault for this, we're like, why can't you just do this like your brother? Because God didn't make him like his brother. God gave him something different. You know what? So as churches throughout our city, as people say, you know what, this church is doing that God's not going to ask me, Ben, did you do the assignment I had for City Church? Did you do the assignment I had for Reality Church? He's going to say, Ben, did you lead Epic Church in the assignment I had for Epic? This is so freeing. It's going to be a faithfulness question, not a comparison trap. Are you, when you think about the trajectory of what God's given you, are you on path to be able to say, as best I understood it, I didn't get it perfect, but as best I understood it, God, with the gifts you gave me, I finished the course you gave me. I completed the mission you gave my life. God's not going to ask me to complete the mission he gives my kids. He's going to ask me to complete the mission that he gives me. And he's going to ask you the same question. He's going to ask you the same question. As we get ready to close, I just want to just be honest and just say the thing that we've talked about today, it's a struggle for me. It's one thing to talk about grace all the time from the stage, and it's another thing to go throughout my week and feel like I've got to measure up, And I can find myself in settings where maybe we've been able to accomplish more than the people I'm around, and you know what? Arrogance starts to rise. But then, at the same conference, moments later, I'm around the people who grew mega churches overnight. I'm like, oh boy, I don't measure up. But just to be freed, I know that when I think about my life where I've come, the only way I can describe it and define it is to say that God's grace has pervaded it, and it's pervaded yours. And one way to think about this is when we know our heart's in the right place, first of all, we'll have humility rather than pride, but we won't spend so much time thinking about what we don't have. We'll spend more time being grateful for what God has given us. We realize it's grace. It's grace. You don't have to compare yourself to the person sitting beside you, right? Grace really levels the playing field. And those of you, when you're having a good week, you wish it was the other way around because you feel like you somehow have earned it. You'll never earn it. Not on your best day. Not if you give $10,000 to these kids in Uganda this year. Not if you never miss church this next year. You will never earn it. But the beautiful reality, you don't have to. Jesus earned it for you. The question is, can we rest in that? Is that enough for us? When you find it to be enough, you'll be freed. Free to love God well. Free from caring about yourself so much. And free to live deeply attached to each other in this community because you realize because Jesus carried your burden, your hands are now free to carry the burdens of others. And I think the more and more we do this, the more we become the church God intended when he birthed this thing. I hope we'll lean into grace, not our performance, not our accomplishments, not our capacity or capability. Use those things. But when we stack ourselves up in regards to God, we look at the cross, not at our resume or portfolio. And that's a good thing. Would you pray with me? I want to pray in just a moment, and then these guys are going to just lead us in a song of reflection, I think an appropriate song. The idea out of the text today is that we don't need to be worried about how great or not great we are. We need to be really into how great God is, and so we just want to sing that somewhat familiar song before we finish today. But I just want to ask you, what's your response? I mean, it could certainly just in this quiet moment be confession, like just, wow, God, I have forfeited grace and I've thrown it aside, and God, I've begun to think that I have to be jealous of what people have, or I need to be conceited because I'm better. What does it look like just to recognize in this moment, just, you know what, God, it's grace. Paul said it to the church in Ephesus like this, is, for by grace you've been saved. This not of yourself, it is a gift of God. It's not by works so that no one may boast. Just that recognition that God, without you, I am nothing. But God, in you, I have everything. And maybe that's the response. Maybe your response, as Tim talked about a second ago, is to realize that baptism is a huge deal, not because it makes us right with God, but because it shows that we've been made right with God. It's very much a communal celebration, and you need to be a part of it in 2 weeks. And so I want to encourage you, don't delay if that's you. And then we continue our Around the Table groups this month. And some of you have been at Epic for a while and just haven't attached yourself to the community. And so I want to give you a chance, not in some large group way on a Sunday, but through sitting at a table with 10 to 15 other people and getting to know them and having people that can depend on you for what they need and that you can depend on for what you need. God, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for this series. God, I thank you for showing me what grace looks like, not just in how I relate to you, but in how I relate to the people in this room. God, because of grace, I can't look down on anyone. But God, I don't have to look up at anyone either. I don't have to prove myself. God, I don't have to earn anything because what's most precious in my life, God, can't be earned. It can only be received. And I thank you for Jesus, and I pray that he would be continually what we as a church orient ourselves around. And God, as we do that, it will always have implications for us as a community. And I pray that we become the church that you had in mind when you birthed this vision in our hearts. May it be so. You guys feel free to stand as we just declare not how great each other are, but how great God is, and just continue to reflect on what we've learned so far.